Matthew's gospel says this: after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother and led them up to a high mountain apart. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is well that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 booths here, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He was still speaking when, lo, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were filled with awe. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise, have no fear." And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." All right, end of gospel passage here. All right, so there are lots of questions we can ask here. A few that I want to highlight are this. Number one, why does Matthew highlight for you the timing here? He says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John up the mountain. Why is that important? He doesn't always tell you how many days have transpired before an event happens in the gospel. So what's the significance of it being after 6 days? Next, why does Jesus just take Peter, James, and John up the mountain? Why doesn't he take all 12 apostles up the mountain, or all the crowds up the mountain? Why these 3 particular figures? Another question, what does it mean when it says that Jesus was transfigured? Why does his face shine like the sun and his garments become white as light? What is the meaning of this? Or should I say, what would that have meant to a Jew in a first century context? To Peter and James and John, they were all Jewish. So what would be the symbolism, the significance of this revelation of Jesus' glory? I mean, obviously on one level, it's showing his glory, his divine glory. But what would it have meant to them? Another question, why does Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus to talk with him? Right? Why these 2 particular figures? And then also, what does Peter mean when he says, "Lord, it's good that we're here," or "well that we're here"? And why do he and the other disciples respond to the voice and the cloud in the way that they do? So if you remember, the bright cloud overshadows them and the voice comes out of the cloud, and it says they're filled with awe and they fall on their faces, right? Why do they fall on their faces? What is the significance of that cloud coming down on top of the mountain? And then finally, last but not least significantly, after they go down the mountain again, why does Jesus tell them, "Shh, don't tell anybody until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead"? So let's go through each one of these together. The first point that I would highlight here is just basic issue of transfiguration. The Greek word here for transfigure is metamorpho in Greek, metamorpho, where we get the word metamorphosis from. So it signifies a radical change here. So Jesus' appearance is being radically transfigured, radically transformed, where they can see his divine glory. So this was a momentous occasion here. It's not that Jesus had like a special look in his eyes or on his face or something like that. I mean, this was a radical change. And that's why the word transfigure is an excellent way of expressing what that Greek word means. So Jesus was metamorphosis before them. That's not a real word, but I just made it up just to give you a feel for the power of the Greek. That's the first point. The second point is that many of the questions that I just asked can be answered by recognizing that for a first century Jew, they would have seen several parallels between the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain and the Old Testament accounts of Moses on Mount Sinai, right? So that's really the key to unlocking this mystery of the transfiguration. So if you go back to the book of Exodus, especially chapters 24 and chapters 34, there are a number of striking parallels between Moses on Mount Sinai and Jesus on the mountain of the Transfiguration, which, by the way, we don't know the name for the mountain. It's traditionally Mount Tabor in the Holy Land today, but the gospel never tells us, so I'll just call it the mountain of Transfiguration. So here are some of the parallels. For example, in the book of Exodus, number 1, it says that Moses went up the mountain of Sinai on the 7th day, right? Same thing with the Transfiguration. It takes place after 6 days on top of the mountain. So Jesus is acting like a new Moses. Second, when Moses goes up the mountain of Mount Sinai, he takes with him 3 special companions, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. Aaron was the high priest, and Moses' brother, and then Nadab and Abihu were his 2 sons. They were brothers as well. So what does Jesus do? He goes up the mountain with Peter, who's kind of like the high priest of the new covenant. I don't have time to get into that right now. You can get my CD, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Papacy, if you want to look at it. But he brings up Peter and then James and John, who are also brothers, just like Nadab and Abihu. Why does he bring these 3 up? Because he's preparing them for an experience like Moses had. When Moses went up the mountain to meet God, he brought Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. Jesus brings Peter, James, and John up the mountain for the same reason. Number 3, when Moses went up the mountain of Sinai, it says that when he came down, his face shone with the glory of having been in the presence of God, that it reflected the glory of God whom he encountered at the top of the mountain. Whereas in the gospel, Jesus goes up the mountain, but his face is transfigured and it shines like the sun with its own light, right? So what's going on here? Well, Jesus is both similar to Moses, but he's greater than Moses because he's being revealed as the divine Son of God. As the voice says from the cloud, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Fourth, and this is really important, people often miss it. When Moses went up the mountain in the Old Testament, it said that the glory, the kavod, the glory cloud of the Lord came down upon the top of Mount Sinai. This was the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. The later rabbis would go on to call it the Shekinah. Southern preachers will often say the Shekinah glory cloud, but that's the Hebrew is Shekinah. And so it's the tabernacling presence of God, the glory of the Lord. In the Old Testament, the same thing happens here in the New Testament. When Moses and Elijah appear and are talking with Jesus, and the disciples see them, it said a cloud overshadowed them, and the disciples are filled with awe, and they fall on their faces. Why? Well, because they know as Jews that when the glory cloud comes down, God himself is coming down to be in their presence. So this is a theophany, a revelation of God, an appearance of God happening on the top of the mountain. Finally, in the Old Testament, when the cloud descended, it says that God spoke to Moses from the cloud. And the same thing's true here in the New Testament. The voice of the Father speaks from the cloud and says the words, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." So just like the cloud, God spoke from the cloud in the Old Testament, so too he does in the New Testament. So what then is the Mountain of Transfiguration? What's the mystery here? Well, the mystery is that this is like a new Mount Sinai, right? Jesus is acting like a new Moses, but he's a new and greater Moses. And he's bringing the disciples up that mountain to encounter God, to enter into the mystery of God, and to also reveal to them his divine sonship. I mean, up to this point, he's only shown them, in a sense, the veil of his humanity, right? They see him eat, they see him drink, they see him get tired, but now he's showing them, not only is he fully man, but he's also a divine person. He's the glorious Son of the Father.